In November 2022, during a necropsy on an 18-foot Burmese python taken from Everglades National Park, researchers opened the stomach and removed a 5-foot American alligator, still intact, not in pieces, not partially digested. A whole alligator, recovered in one piece from inside a snake. And the reason that footage was viewed more than 10 million times is the same reason biologists had trouble with it. By the mathematics of what a snake's mouth can do, the animal in that stomach should not have fit. Start with the mechanism, because almost everything the public believes about it is false. Snakes do not dislocate their jaws. Not pythons, not anacondas, not any of them. The image is so widespread that it's become a kind of folk fact, a snake unhinging itself to accommodate something enormous, and it does not describe anything that happens in a real animal. A dislocated joint is an injury. No predator could survive doing it at every meal. What a python has instead is a skull built on a completely different plan from a mammal's. The lower jaw isn't one bone, it's two independent halves, and they aren't fused together at the chin the way yours are, but they're joined by an elastic ligament that lets the two sides separate and move independently of each other. The quadrate bones connecting the jaw to the skull act as double-jointed levers rather than a fixed hinge, swinging outward and rotating to add reach. The teeth curve backward, so nothing that goes in can slide out. And then the swallowing itself is not swallowing in any sense you would recognize. The snake does not pull the prey in. It walks its skull over the prey, advancing one side of the lower jaw, hooking the recurved teeth, anchoring, then advancing the other side. The animal is not being drawn down a throat. The head is being ratcheted forward around it, one side at a time. That system is what determines the ceiling. Not muscle, not aggression, not body length. It's the maximum size of the opening that the whole assembly can form, and biologists have a word for that measurement. They call it gape. And until very recently, everybody had the number wrong. One more thing about the machinery, because it explains why the process takes as long as it does. A python swallowing large prey cannot breathe the way it normally would. The mouth is completely occupied, sometimes for hours. So it pushes the glottis, the opening of its windpipe, forward along the floor of the mouth and out past the prey, effectively extending a breathing tube around the obstruction. The snake keeps respiring throughout, past an animal wedged in its own throat. Then the prey has to be moved. Waves of muscular contraction walk it down the body, and the ribs, unattached to any breastbone because snakes don't have one, spread apart to let it through. There is no point in the process where the animal is compressed or broken up. It goes in the shape it was in. That's what makes the ceiling so absolute. A predator that dismembers its food has flexibility. A lion is not limited by the size of a buffalo. A python has no such option. Whatever it eats must pass a fixed aperture intact, and the size of that aperture is the single number that governs everything this animal is capable of. Here's the problem researchers were up against. If you want to predict what an invasive predator will eat, which is the entire question in the Everglades, you need to know the biggest thing it can physically get down. And you can't reasonably measure every python, so you build a model, gape scales with body size and a known relationship, and you extrapolate. The models were wrong, and they were wrong in the worst possible direction. In 2024, Bruce Jane, a biology professor at the University of Cincinnati, published a study with two biologists from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, Ian Easterling and Ian Bartoshek, in the journal Reptiles and Amphibians. Rather than modeling, they measured, directly on 3 of the largest Burmese pythons ever captured in Florida, individuals of 15, 17, and 19 feet, the last of them the longest documented capture on record. The previous largest gape measured in a Burmese python was 22 centimeters in diameter, about 8 3/4 inches. The snakes Jane examined reached 26 centimeters, 10.2 inches. That sounds like a modest increase until you do the geometry, and the geometry is the whole finding. Gape isn't a length, it's an opening, so what matters is area, and area scales with the square of the diameter. Jane's measurement represents roughly a 40% increase in total gape area over the previous maximum. The circumference of the largest opening came out past 81 centimeters. Jane offered a comparison that makes it concrete, and it's the one worth keeping. That's the waistband of a 32-inch pair of trousers. The critical part isn't the raw number, it's the scaling. Jane's central finding is that maximal gape does not rise in simple proportion to body length. It expands disproportionately as the snake gets larger. A python twice as long isn't twice as dangerous. The ceiling on what it can eat climbs much faster than its body does, which means the biggest snakes in the Everglades have capabilities that no model built on smaller animals would ever have predicted. So the shouldn't be possible in this file has a precise meaning. It isn't that scientists doubted pythons could eat alligators. It's that the numbers everyone was using said a 5-foot alligator was beyond the limit, and the numbers were built on measurements from snakes that were too small. There's a reason the error ran in that direction rather than the other, and it's not carelessness. Enormous pythons are rare and difficult to obtain, so early gape work was necessarily done on the animals available, which were smaller. Extrapolating upward from those is standard practice and usually fine, because most biological measurements scale predictably. Gape doesn't. And the mismatch compounds, because the underestimate is worst precisely at the top of the size range, where the ecological consequences are largest. The snakes the models described least accurately are the ones capable of eating the biggest animals. Jane's own framing of what it means is restrained and, read carefully, not reassuring. This is the tip of the iceberg in terms of their impact on prey populations, which raises the obvious question: what does that new ceiling actually permit? In December 2022, on private property near Naples, Easterling and Bartoszek came across something no one had ever witnessed in the wild before. A female Burmese python, 14 feet 10 inches long and weighing 115 pounds, was in the process of swallowing a full-grown, white-tailed deer. The deer weighed 77 pounds. Parts of white-tailed deer had turned up in python necropsies before. Biologists knew it happened. Nobody had ever watched it happen. Work the ratio and the scale of it lands properly. The deer represented roughly 67% of the snake's entire body mass. A predator was consuming, in one meal, 2/3 of its own weight. And when Jane's team measured that specific case against the new gape data, the deer came out at 93% of the snake's maximal gape area, meaning the animal was operating at the very edge of what its skull could open to. And it worked. Bartoszek's description of it is the line that stayed with me. Watching an invasive apex predator swallow a full-sized deer in front of you is something you never forget. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's own figure puts the outer bound higher still. Pythons can consume meals equivalent to 100% of their body mass. Now apply that to alligators, and the arithmetic stops being surprising and starts being obvious. A gator of that size is a narrow, elongated animal. Its widest point is its head and shoulder girdle, and that cross-section is well within a 26-centimeter gape. Length is irrelevant to a predator that ratchets its skull along the prey rather than biting it into portions. What matters is the widest circumference, and by that measure, an alligator is an easier shape to swallow than a deer of the same weight. And an alligator brings something to that encounter no deer does: armor, teeth, and a bite that closes with more force than nearly anything else in North America, which is exactly why size decides these meetings so completely. A constrictor doesn't win by outfighting its prey, it wins by getting coils around it before the prey can respond. Against a 5-foot alligator, an 18-foot python has the reach and the mass to do that. The alligator's weaponry never gets used. Reverse the proportions and the same encounter runs the other way, which is what the last part of this file is about. So the 18-foot python in the 2022 necropsy wasn't doing something exceptional for an animal of its size. It was doing something the old models had failed to account for. But there's a reason biologists were cautious about that footage anyway, and it isn't about anatomy. Here is where the honest version diverges from the viral version. Rosie Moore, the geoscientist who filmed the necropsy that went around the world, was asked directly how common this is. Her answer was careful, and it deserves repeating rather than skipping. While reports of python on alligator predation and the reverse have been increasing, she would not characterize it as a common occurrence. Typically, she noted, these snakes target other reptiles, along with birds, rodents, and small mammals. That's a researcher declining to oversell her own footage, and it's the most useful sentence in the entire story. The historical record supports the caution. When scientists tallied python-alligator encounters in the mid-2000s, they had documented 4 in 3 years. 4. Not 4 a month, 4 total in the whole system, over 3 years. These are noteworthy events precisely because they are not routine, and the failures are as instructive as the successes. In September of 2005, park officials found a scene in a remote part of Everglades National Park in South Miami-Dade that became one of the most reproduced wildlife photographs of the decade. A 13-foot Burmese python had attempted to swallow a live 6-foot alligator whole. The snake's stomach ruptured. Both animals died. The photograph shows the alligator's carcass protruding through the middle of the snake. That's what the edge of the envelope looks like when a python misjudges it. The 13-footer was working well outside its gape class, and the attempt killed it. And it's worth being precise about what that photograph does and doesn't show, because it has been used to argue both directions for 20 years. It is not evidence that alligators defeat pythons. The alligator died too. Nor does it show that pythons routinely eat alligators. This one couldn't. What it actually documents is a single animal attempting something beyond its physical limit, in a system where neither species has any evolved sense of the other's capabilities, which is the same phenomenon at the opposite end of the size range as the juvenile python in the telemetry study that died attacking something larger than itself. So assemble the picture properly, because the accurate version is stranger than the exaggerated one. A very large python, 15 feet and upward, can swallow an alligator of moderate size, and the 2024 gape data explains exactly how. A 13-foot python attempting the same thing can die trying. And the behavior, across a wetland holding tens of thousands of snakes, remains uncommon enough that researchers count individual incidents rather than estimating rates. What the University of Florida's Frank Mazzotti drew from the 2005 case is the durable conclusion, and it doesn't depend on frequency at all. It means nothing in the Everglades is safe from pythons as a top-down predator. Nothing. Including, it turns out, the thing everybody assumed sat at the top. Except the traffic runs both directions, and that's the part almost nobody knows. The Everglades apex predator did not simply concede the position. Researchers working with the U.S. Geological Survey ran a radiotelemetry study on juvenile Burmese pythons in Big Cypress National Preserve, tracking tagged young snakes to find out what happens to them. Because if native predators are killing juvenile pythons, that changes the population maths for the entire invasion. The question mattered because it wasn't obvious. Native snake-eating predators in Florida evolved hunting native snakes. Whether they would recognize a similarly sized juvenile python as food at all was genuinely unknown. They do. The study implicated at least 4 native species in juvenile python deaths: 3 Florida cottonmouths, 1 hispid cotton rat, a rodent killing a snake, 3 mesomammals, and 5 American alligators. 5 separate tagged juvenile pythons killed by the animal this video is nominally about being eaten. The alligator is now a documented predator of the invasive species that everybody assumed had no predators at all. It isn't alone, either. The published record of confirmed python predators in Florida runs to the American alligator, documented back in 2006, the Gulf Coast indigo snake in 2018, the bobcat in 2021, and possibly the Florida black bear. Then there's the single strangest data point in the whole file, and it's about a python that lost. One of the tagged juveniles died attempting to subdue a prey item 106% of its own size, larger than itself. That attempt constitutes the largest predator-to-prey size ratio ever reported for pythons in that size class, and the researchers' interpretation is worth sitting with. They suggest it may reflect behavioral variation in individual juvenile pythons that turns out to be maladaptive in the novel Florida environment. In plain terms, some of these snakes are attacking things they cannot possibly handle, in a place their instincts weren't built for, and it's killing them. There's a second implication in that study that matters more than the individual deaths, and it's about arithmetic rather than drama. An invasive population's growth depends on how many juveniles survive to breed. If native predators in the Everglades are removing juvenile pythons at any meaningful rate, the invasion's trajectory is not what a model assuming zero predation would produce. That's why researchers put transmitters into small snakes in the first place. Not to find out whether an alligator can kill a young python, that was never really in doubt, but to find out whether it routinely does, and whether the ecosystem is beginning to absorb this animal into its existing food web, rather than simply losing to it. The early answer appears to be yes, partially and slowly, which is a long way from a solution, and considerably better than nothing. It also reframes the entire question the title asks. The honest answer is that biologists finally know, and what they know is messier than a headline. Very large Burmese pythons kill and consume alligators, and the 2024 gape research explains the mechanism that made it seem impossible. That much is settled. What is not settled, what the researchers themselves keep declining to claim, is that this represents a systematic predator-prey relationship. It's documented, it's real, it's rare enough to be counted case by case, and it goes both ways. The two largest reptiles in that ecosystem are eating each other, opportunistically, with the outcome decided almost entirely by relative size at the moment they meet. A 5-foot alligator meeting an 18-foot python loses. A juvenile python meeting an adult alligator loses. A 13-foot python that misreads a 6-foot alligator loses along with the alligator. There is no established hierarchy here yet. There's a novel arrangement, roughly 30 years old, between two apex animals that never shared a continent. And it's still resolving. That's genuinely unusual, and it's worth naming plainly. Most predator-prey relationships people can describe were settled over millions of years, long enough for the prey to evolve responses and for both populations to find an equilibrium. This one has had 3 decades. Neither animal has had time to develop anything specific to the other. What's happening in that swamp is two large opportunists meeting for the first time, repeatedly, with no script. And that's the part the gape study actually changed. Not our understanding of a single grizzly necropsy, our understanding of the ceiling. Because Jane's central finding was about scaling, and pythons in Florida are still growing. The 19-footer he measured is the longest confirmed capture so far. There is no biological reason it stands as the maximum. Every foot those snakes add expands the gape faster than the body, which means the list of animals in Florida too large to be swallowed gets shorter every year. And the mechanism repeating here isn't about snakes. Every serious problem in this file traces to a measurement taken on the wrong animals. Gape models built from ordinary pythons underestimated exceptional ones. Assumptions about what native predators would recognize as prey were untested until somebody put transmitters in juvenile snakes. The belief that pythons had no predators in Florida survived 4 years until the record accumulated: alligator in 2006, indigo snake in 2018, bobcat in 2021, one paper at a time. Each of those corrections took a decade or more, and the invasion did not pause while they happened. That's the shape of it. A large predator arrives somewhere it doesn't belong, and the science describing what it will do is necessarily built on data from where it came from smaller animals, from a different ecosystem, from a food web that had co-evolved with it. The predictions run behind reality by exactly as long as it takes to gather new measurements in the new place. Nobody designed the one in South Florida. It began with a pet trade, a climate that happened to match, and several decades of nobody counting. What makes it scientifically unusual is that it's being documented while it runs. Most invasions on this scale were reconstructed afterwards from wreckage and guesswork. This one has transmitters in it. South Florida is currently the largest such experiment happening anywhere in the world. Somewhere in Big Cypress tonight there's a juvenile python carrying a transmitter, and in a few months a researcher will learn whether it was eaten and by what. Maybe the natives adapt fast enough to matter. Maybe the number gets revised upward again the first time somebody lands a 20-footer. Or maybe the answer keeps depending, as it does now, on which animal happens to be larger on the day. What's certain is that the ceiling out there has already been revised once in the wrong direction and rests on measurements from exactly 3 animals. That the sawgrass closes over it and reports nothing. And that the largest python anyone has ever caught in Florida was 19 feet, which isn't a limit. It's just the biggest one found so far.